Hello, economics. Welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 2, Shifts of the Demand Curve. The key idea for our lesson today is that the demand curve for a good can shift due to changes in taste, income, the prices of related goods, expectations about the future, and the number of buyers in a market. Our learning objectives for today's lesson are the following, and we have 3 of them. So again, these are the things you should be able to do at the end of this lesson. Number 1, you should be able to identify what shifts the demand curve to the left and what shifts it to the right. You should also be able to distinguish between the terms quantity demanded and demand. And lastly, you should be able to explain how goods are categorized as normal goods, inferior goods, substitutes, and complements. The demand curve tells the story of how much consumers will buy at every price. That story can change. For example, the demand for umbrellas changes when it rains. The demand for sports cars changes when income rises. And the demand for orange juice changes when we're persuaded to have a healthy dose of vitamin C every day. Changes in demand typically cause the price of the good and the quantity sold to change as well, as we'll investigate later. This lesson explores the reasons for changes in demand and the demand curve shifts that result. In our previous lesson, we explained that a change in the price of a good causes a movement along the demand curve for that good. Consider the movement from point A to point B in the graph, which shows that for $1, consumers would buy 100 oranges. But if the price changed, in this case dropped to 75 cents, consumers would now be willing to purchase 200 oranges. As we look at how changes in price cause movements along the demand curve, right? This is a movement along the demand curve. We assume that all other influences on the purchases of oranges do not change. Now, suppose that a successful advertising campaign makes people more aware of the health benefits of eating oranges. This will change people's tastes for oranges. At any particular price, people will be willing to buy more oranges than before. Looking at the graph here, we see that this causes the entire demand curve to shift to the right. From demand 1, notice it's labeled here, this is demand 1, to shifting over demand 2, labeled here. Consider the quantity demanded at a price of $1, which again, I'm going to erase this up here now. So again, we have the price at $1. Previously, people were willing to buy 100 oranges, like we saw in our previous graph, and as we see here, they're willing to buy 100 oranges at $1. Now, however, with the change in taste, they are willing to buy, for that same $1, right, at price of $1, they're now willing to buy 150 oranges. While the effect of a price change was illustrated by sliding a pencil along the existing demand curve, right? So if we have a change in price, we just slide along our current demand curve. The effect of a change in taste is illustrated by picking up our pencil and drawing a new line. So, right? So if the change is $1 to 75 cents, we move along the demand curve. If the price stays the same, but the quantity demanded changes, then something else has caused that change in quantity demanded. In this case, more people want more oranges because they believe it's healthier for them. And so they're willing now to buy 150. And so we now draw a new demand curve here. A shift of the demand curve means that at every price, the amount people are willing and able to buy has changed. We just saw that example in our previous graph. This graph illustrates another possible shift of the demand curve for oranges, this time to the left. What would cause a leftward shift? Suppose the price of apples decreases. Many people are content with either apples or oranges. So when apples become less expensive, more people will choose apples over oranges. At a price of $1, for example, people are now willing to buy only 50 oranges, as shown on our graph. So, again, this is the demand curve for oranges. We start at $1 with a quantity demand of 100 oranges. But if the price of apples changes, in this case decreases, more people are going to buy apples, and therefore the demand at $1 for oranges decreases to 50 at $1, which means that we're going to draw a new demand curve, a new line. The quantity of oranges people are willing to buy decreases at other prices too, right? So notice here at 75 cents on our old demand curve, 75 cents means that there was a quantity demanded of 200 oranges, but now on our new one, it is only 150, and the same thing here, right? We have decreased at 50 cents. We've decreased from 300 to 250. So let's talk about why this is the case and the difference between movement along the demand curve, like this, and shift of a demand curve when we draw a new demand curve. The language of demand. Let's take another look at terms with precise meanings in economics. We've seen that quantity demanded refers to a particular quantity that people want to buy at a specific price, while demand refers to the relationship between price and quantity demanded, as represented by the entire demand curve. The proper use of these terms helps us distinguish between a movement along a demand curve and a shift of the demand curve. When we move along a demand curve, we call the resulting change in the quantity that consumers want to buy a change in the quantity demanded. For example, the drop in price from $1 to 75 cents caused a movement along the demand curve. Right? When we dropped from $1 to 75 cents, we moved along the demand curve. In this case, demand 1. And an increase in the quantity demanded from 100 to 200 oranges. And that follows our law of demand. As a price decreases, quantity demanded increases. When the demand curve shifts, as we see down here, in this case shifting to the right, which we draw an arrow to help illustrate that, we call the change in consumers' willingness to buy the product a change in demand. For example, the change in taste in favor of oranges caused an increase in demand, which we show as a shift from the demand curve 1, our light purple one, to demand curve 2, our darker purple line. And again, so a shift in the demand means that we draw a new demand curve. Something other than price has caused this change, and we draw a new demand curve. And we draw an arrow to indicate our starting demand, again demand 1, in this case a light purple line, to demand 2, a new demand curve indicated by demand 2 and a darker line on this particular chart. If you are asked what happens to the demand for running shoes when there is a citywide sale and prices are marked down, the correct answer is nothing. Demand refers to the entire demand curve, and a change in price does not cause the demand curve itself to change. The sell on running shoes causes a movement along the demand curve, but this is an increase in the quantity demanded, not an increase in demand. If the announcement of a new if the announcement of a new race led to an increase in the quantity of running shoes consumers were willing to buy at any given price, that would constitute an increase in demand. One more time. It's easy to confuse a movement along the demand curve with a shift of the curve because both represent changes in consumers' buying behavior. Here's a simple rule to help you keep them straight. A change in the price of the good causes a movement along the demand curve. A change in any influence on consumers' buying behavior other than the price of the good causes the demand curve to shift. What causes the demand curve to shift? We've learned that price changes cause a change in the quantity demanded, and changes in some other factors cause the demand curve to shift. But what are these factors that shift the demand curve? The 5 emphasized by economists, because they play a central role in many markets, are tastes, income, the prices of related goods, expectations, and the number of buyers. Let's explore each of these in turn. Tastes. Particular styles of goods, including clothing, jewelry, music, cars, and computers, rise and fall in popularity. Depending on the year, for example, the jeans in fashion might have straight, flared, or bootcut legs, and they might be low-rise, stonewashed, distressed, baggy, or tight. Tastes change and styles go in and out of favor for many reasons. Sometimes the wardrobes of famous people influence the tastes of the broader population, as when the styles of first ladies and royalty cause buying frenzies. Firms try to influence taste by hiring advertising agencies to promote new products and styles. A successful ad campaign convinces customers to be willing to buy more of a good or service at every price. Earlier, you saw how a change in taste can shift the demand curve for oranges by changing the quantity demanded at every price. Likewise, if a style of jeans, music, or car becomes more attractive to consumers, the demand curve for that product will shift to the right. If a good becomes less popular or attractive, the demand curve will shift to the left. Income. The amount of money people earn affects the amount they are willing and able to spend. A rise in income means there is more money to spend on consumption. A fall in income generally causes people to cut back on the quantity of goods they buy. What would happen to your purchases of clothing if your income fell because you lost your after-school job? Chances are they would fall. If the demand for a particular good rises when income rises and falls when income falls, we call it a normal good. Most goods are normal goods. For example, when people have more income, they tend to buy more newspapers, cars, fruit juice, televisions, and restaurant meals. Not all goods are normal goods, however. For the goods known as inferior goods, a rise in income actually leads to a fall in demand. An example of an inferior good is intercity bus transportation. Buses are popular among students and others with relatively low incomes. A rise in income leads people to take buses less frequently and instead drive or take a plane between cities. In developing countries such as India and China, bicycles are an inferior good. As people become wealthier, they tend to buy cars and fewer bicycles. Canned meat and processed cheese are other examples of inferior goods. For a normal good, a rise in income causes a rightward shift of the demand curve. When income rises, people want to buy more of the normal good at every price. For an inferior good, a rise in income causes the demand curve to shift to the left. At every price, people want to buy less of the inferior good, when income is high than when income is low. The prices of related goods. Earlier, we saw that when the price of apples fell, people ate more apples and fewer oranges. This shifted the demand curve for oranges. In other words, a change in the price of one good can shift the demand curve for another good. Consider the demand curve for hot dogs. What would happen if the price of hamburgers increased? We would expect some consumers to switch from eating hamburgers to eating hot dogs to avoid the new higher price of hamburgers. This would shift the demand curve for hot dogs to the right. The price of hamburgers affects the demand for hot dogs because hot dogs and hamburgers are substitutes for each other. One can take the place of the other. When two goods are substitutes, an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in demand for the other. The opposite is true as well. A decrease in the price of a substitute encourages some customers to switch to that good, which decreases demand for the other. DVDs are a substitute for movie downloads. Tea is a substitute for coffee. And Burger King burgers are a substitute for McDonald's burgers. Some pairs of goods go well together. For example, buns and hot dogs are complements. When people buy one of these goods, they are likely to also buy the other. When two goods are complements, an increase in the price of one of the goods leads to a decrease in the demand for the other. Suppose the price of buns increases. Eating a hot dog on a bun will now be more expensive, so people will buy fewer hot dogs at every price for hot dogs. The demand for hot dogs decreases, and the demand curve for hot dogs shifts leftward. Similar complementary relationships between goods are common. If the price of maple syrup rises, a meal of pancakes with syrup becomes more expensive, so the demand for pancakes will shift to the left. If the price of gasoline rises, the demand curve for SUVs will shift to the left. And if the price of tennis balls rises, the demand curve for tennis rackets will shift to the left. These effects work in reverse as well. If the price of gasoline falls, it will become less expensive to drive an SUV, and the demand curve for SUVs will shift to the right. Expectations. Your expectations about the future price of a good can influence your demand for the good today. If you think the price of a good will fall in the future, you are likely to postpone your purchase of that good until the price is lower. Because expectations about future prices affect the quantity you demand at every price, they cause demand curves to shift. For example, there is a leftward shift in the demand curve for Macy's clothing in the days before a major sale. Expectations that the price of a good will rise in the future lead people to buy more of it today. For example, suppose consumers expect the price of gasoline to increase soon, perhaps due to a new conflict in oil-producing countries. Many are likely to buy more gasoline now, even if their gas tanks are far from empty. This increase in the quantity of gasoline demanded at every price shifts the demand curve for gasoline to the right. A similar situation occurs when consumers know that a change in sales taxes is coming up. Many states temporarily suspend the sales tax on clothing and other items for a week before school starts each year to encourage families to go shopping, especially for back-to-school items. If it is late August and people know there will be no sales tax in a week or two, they will probably postpone some of their purchases. The future opportunity for tax-free purchases causes people to buy less clothing at every price today, which shifts the demand curve for clothing to the left. This is a shift in the demand curve and not a movement along it, because people buy less clothing even though the price did not change. Like changing expectations about prices, changing expectations about future income affect the demand for goods today. Rather than waiting for an anticipated increase in income to arrive before spending some of it, consumers like to spread out their expenditures. If new information about a job offer or a raise brings you to expect a higher income in the future, your consumption of normal goods is likely to increase now. You might buy a new outfit or upgrade your laptop. When the economy as a whole shows strong signs of improvement, many people expect higher incomes in the future. And the demand curves for many normal goods shift rightward. Going in the other direction, if there is a forecast for lower incomes in the future, people start spending less immediately, and the demand curves for many normal goods shifts leftward. The number of buyers. The fifth and final factor that can shift the demand curve is the number of buyers in the market. Remember that to draw the market demand curve, we add together the quantities demanded by each of the individual consumers at every price. If the number of consumers in a market increases, say because the population grows, then the market demand curve shifts to the right. In our graph below, we have taken the market for gasoline from our previous lesson. You'll remember when we did gasoline and how to construct a market demand curve. And we're adding a third customer or consumer, Tanya. Tanya's is indicated by this purple one here, and we can see that in our legend we have here individual demand, Tanya. Here we have, and these colors are a little close together, but our next one here, this line here, is the market demand without Tanya. So that's before we've added Tanya. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to look at this, and we're going to see that our market demand, right, before Tanya is added to the population or the number of buyers increases, we're on this blue line here. When we add her individual demand curve, or her individual, right, her individual, yes, demand curve, as illustrated here, we add these numbers to the total. So you can see here at $2, Tanya has a quantity demanded of 10. So we've added 10 to the market, moving it from 50 to 60 gallons of gasoline. And so this one line here is our new, right, market demand curve. And this is a shift. Although this one doesn't change here at $4, it's still just 10. Notice every other one at every price has changed or shifted to the right. So this would be an increase. This would be a change in the demand curve and a shift to the right. We would also notice something similar, but in the opposite direction, if the number of buyers decreased. So if Tanya were to be taken back out of the market, let me change colors here to green. If Tanya were to be taken out of the market, we would subtract her individual demand curve numbers from our market, because we would be here when she's in it. So we'd subtract and we'd have our new line, which is the line that we had here before. And we would have a shift to the left of our demand curve. All right, that ends this lesson. We will, of course, be practicing this and going over these. So go ahead and work on your concept check, and we will see you in class soon.